A cruel millionaire forced a waitress to play the violin at a luxury party to humiliate her. However, when she started playing the violin, everyone was left speechless. The hum of the city streets outside was a constant reminder of the world moving forward without pause. But in the small, dimly lit room where Abigail sat, the world slowed down. She rested her violin on her shoulder, the bow poised above the strings, and let out a slow, steady breath. Her fingers danced over the worn wood, finding the notes she'd played 1,000 times, yet each time felt like the first. Her eyes closed as the melody filled the room, soft, melancholic, and filled with memories of her grandfather, who had given her this very violin. The instrument was old, its surface faded and scratched, but it was her most prized possession. Her grandfather had been a musician in a small-town orchestra, and before he passed, he gave her the violin, telling her, "This violin is more than just wood and strings. Abigail, it's a bridge to your dreams. Keep playing, and one day, it'll take you there." His words stayed with her every time she played. But life wasn't easy for a girl like Abigail. Born to a humble family, her mother worked long hours as a seamstress, and her father was a carpenter, barely making enough to keep them afloat. Savannah was a city of contrasts, its historic beauty and charm often overshadowed by the harsh realities faced by those who lived on the edge of poverty. Abigail's parents worked tirelessly, but they couldn't afford to send her to a prestigious music school or buy her a new violin. All she had was the gift her grandfather left behind and the hope that one day someone would recognize her talent. By day, Abigail worked as a waitress in one of the city's more upscale restaurants. It wasn't glamorous, but it helped her family with the bills. The restaurant attracted the wealthiest residents of Savannah, people who spoke of trips abroad, designer clothes, and summer homes as if they were as common as morning coffee. Abigail listened in as she poured wine and cleared plates, her hands steady and polite, though inside she felt a world apart from the patrons she served. Despite her long hours, Abigail never missed a night of practice. As soon as her shift ended and the restaurant closed its doors, she would rush home, where her parents were usually already asleep after their own exhausting days. She'd tiptoe into the small room they let her use as a practice space, and for the next few hours, lose herself in her music. The city outside would quiet down, and in those moments, it was just her and the violin. It wasn't just a dream for Abigail. It was a need. Playing the violin was how she escaped the weight of her responsibilities and the ever-present anxiety that came with wondering if they'd have enough to make it through the month. It was where she felt free, even if only for a while. But dreams don't pay bills, and opportunities didn't come knocking. Every night, after she finished playing, she'd wonder if this was all life had for her. A series of nights spent playing alone, with no one to hear or see. She had applied for several music academies, but rejection letters were all she received. "You have potential, but we regret to inform you." The words stung every time, but Abigail refused to let them break her. She still had her violin, and as long as she could play, there was hope. As the last note of her practice session hung in the air, Abigail opened her eyes. The room was still and silent, the faint buzz of city life outside barely audible. She lowered the violin and carefully placed it back in its case. Her hands lingered on the worn edges for a moment before she stood up, stretching her tired muscles. The hours had slipped away again, and it was well past midnight. She sighed and walked over to the window, looking out at the quiet streets below. Somewhere, out there, people were living lives she could only dream of. Lives filled with music, applause, and bright lights. She wondered if she'd ever be one of them. Tomorrow, she'd be back at the restaurant, weaving between tables, balancing trays, and smiling politely at people who wouldn't even remember her name by the time they left. But tonight, in this small, silent room, she was more than a waitress. She was a musician, a dreamer, and for a few fleeting moments, that was enough. The clinking of glasses and low hum of conversations filled the grand ballroom of the Whitman estate. The room was bathed in golden light from chandeliers that hung like crystal constellations above the crowd. Every corner of the expansive hall sparkled, from the polished marble floors to the ornate gold-framed mirrors that reflected the evening's extravagance. Guests, draped in designer gowns and tailored tuxedos, floated through the room like they were made of air, sipping champagne and exchanging pleasantries. It was a world far removed from the one Abigail knew. At the center of it all was Garrett Whitman, a man who commanded the space with little more than his presence. He stood tall, perfectly at ease among the city's elite. His smile was sharp, calculated, a smile that never quite reached his eyes. Garrett had been born into wealth, and he wore it like a second skin. Everything about him radiated power and privilege, from the custom suit that hugged his broad shoulders to the way people leaned in when he spoke, eager for even a shred of his attention. He was hosting one of his infamous soirees, lavish events that Savannah's wealthy flocked to for the chance to rub shoulders with the man who could make or break fortunes. For Garrett, these events were a game, a way to display his wealth and remind everyone of their place. Tonight was no different. He had carefully curated every detail, from the gourmet menu to the live orchestra that played softly in the background, creating the perfect atmosphere for the evening's elite to bask in their own importance. Abigail, however, was there for a very different reason. She was just one of the waitstaff, invisible in her simple black uniform, carrying trays of hors d'oeuvres and refilling glasses for people who wouldn't even bother to look her in the eye. She had worked at the Whitman estate events before, and each time felt more surreal than the last. The extravagance, the casual display of wealth. It was a world she could never belong to. As she moved through the crowd, she kept her head down, balancing a tray of champagne flutes with practiced precision. She caught snippets of conversations as she passed by, talk of summer homes in the Hamptons, vacations in Europe, and stock market triumphs. It was also distant from her life, where the most exciting thing that might happen in a week was finding a few extra dollars to buy new strings for her violin. But as much as she tried to blend into the background, Garrett's eyes eventually fell on her. He was in the middle of a conversation with a group of businessmen when his gaze drifted, catching sight of the young woman weaving through the crowd. Something about her caught his attention. Maybe it was the way she moved so quietly, so efficiently, like she was trying to disappear. Or maybe it was the faint look of exhaustion on her face, one he recognized from countless others who had crossed his path, working themselves to the bone for far less than they deserved. Whatever it was, Garrett felt a familiar flicker of amusement. He enjoyed moments like this, where he could remind those below him of their place, remind them that, in his world, they were merely there to serve. "Excuse me," he called out, his voice cutting through the buzz of conversation around him. Abigail's heart skipped a beat. She glanced up, her eyes locking with Garrett's for the briefest moment before she quickly averted her gaze. She wasn't supposed to make eye contact with the guests, especially not someone like Garrett Whitman. The other waitstaff had warned her about him, about his temper, his arrogance, and his cruel sense of humor. She made her way toward him, careful not to spill a drop of the champagne on her tray. When she reached him, Garrett smiled, a smile that made her skin prickle. "What's your name?" he asked, his tone casual but laced with something she couldn't quite place. "Abigail," she replied softly, trying to keep her voice steady. "Abigail," he repeated, savoring the sound of her name like it was a curious little thing. "Tell me, Abigail, what do you do when you're not serving drinks?" She hesitated, unsure of where this was going. "I play the violin," she said quietly, almost wishing she hadn't spoken the words as soon as they left her mouth. Garrett's smile widened. "The violin? How charming." He turned to the men around him, who chuckled at his feigned interest. "Ladies and gentlemen, we have a musician among us," he announced, drawing the attention of those nearby. Abigail's stomach twisted. She could feel the weight of their eyes on her, judging, mocking. She wasn't sure what Garrett wanted from her, but it didn't feel good. Garrett, sensing her discomfort, leaned in slightly, his voice dropping to a more private tone. "Why don't you show us, Abigail? There's a violin right over there, part of the orchestra's set. Why don't you play something for us?" The room seemed to close in on her. Abigail's throat tightened, her palms growing damp. She didn't want to do this, certainly not in front of this crowd, but she also knew that refusing Garrett wasn't an option. People didn't say no to Garrett Whitman. The silence that followed Garrett's challenge was suffocating. Abigail could feel the weight of every pair of eyes in the room on her, watching, waiting for her next move. Her heart hammered against her chest, and her hands grew cold and clammy as she clutched the tray of champagne flutes. She had expected a night of quietly doing her job, disappearing into the background like usual. But now, here she was, standing at the center of attention, not by choice, but by Garrett Whitman's whim. She glanced at the orchestra, where a violin rested on a stand, just waiting for her. It wasn't her violin, the one her grandfather had given her, the one she knew every inch of, but it didn't matter. She didn't want to play, not here, not for these people, who would undoubtedly look at her with judgment, expecting her to fail. The burn of humiliation started to creep up her neck, coloring her cheeks. Garrett was watching her closely, the same amused smile still playing on his lips. He wasn't making a request. This was a command, and there was no escaping it. "Go on, Abigail," he said, his voice light but laced with something darker. "Show us what you've got." The laughter that echoed from the group around him made her skin prickle. She could hear the condescension in their voices, the subtle mockery they didn't even bother to hide. To them, this was all part of the evening's entertainment. Humiliating the help was just another way to pass the time. Taking a shaky breath, Abigail set down the tray on a nearby table, wiping her damp palms on her apron. She walked toward the orchestra, her legs feeling like they were made of lead. The room seemed to stretch out in front of her, the walk to the violin stand feeling agonizingly long. When she reached it, she carefully picked up the violin, her fingers brushing against the strings as she adjusted her grip. It felt foreign in her hands, not at all like her own instrument. Her pulse quickened as she stood in front of the crowd, the weight of their stares pressing down on her. She could see their expectations written on their faces. This poor girl, what did she think she could possibly offer them? Garrett stood off to the side, arms crossed, clearly reveling in the moment. Abigail closed her eyes for a brief second, trying to gather herself. Her mind raced, and for a moment, she wanted nothing more than to drop the violin and run. But she couldn't do that. If she fled now, it would only give Garrett exactly what he wanted, her complete humiliation. Her grandfather's words echoed in her mind. "This violin is your bridge, Abigail. It will take you where you need to go." With a deep breath, she steadied her trembling hands and lifted the bow to the strings. The room was still, the anticipation palpable. She could feel her heart thudding in her ears. But she couldn't focus on that now. She had to focus on the music. She had to let it carry her. The first note was soft, almost hesitant, as it floated through the air. It wasn't perfect, not at first. Her grip was too tight, her fingers stiff from nerves, but as the melody took shape, something inside her shifted. Her muscles relaxed, and her bow hand moved more fluidly. She played the song her grandfather had taught her, the one that always seemed to calm her in the darkest moments. It was a piece filled with sadness, but also with hope. It carried the weight of all her dreams, all her struggles. The laughter that had bubbled up in the crowd before had faded. The mocking whispers stilled. As the notes flowed from the violin, they took on a life of their own, filling the room with a quiet, aching beauty. Abigail's eyes remained closed, and she let the music guide her, losing herself in the melody. For a moment, it was just her and the violin, and nothing else mattered. The room seemed to shrink, the crowd fading into the background as the music enveloped them all. The tension in the air dissipated, replaced by something softer, more profound. The notes hung in the air like a gentle breeze, touching everyone in the room, even those who had initially laughed. Garrett, who had been smiling smugly just moments before, found his expression shifting. The smugness drained from his face, replaced by something else, something that surprised even him. The melody Abigail played stirred something deep within him, something he hadn't felt in years. It was a strange, almost unsettling feeling, like a distant memory trying to resurface. The room remained utterly silent as Abigail played on, her heart and soul poured into every note. For her, this was more than just a performance. It was a release, a way to express everything she couldn't put into words. She didn't care about the audience anymore. This was for her. This was her moment, and she wasn't going to let it slip away. As the last note faded into the silence, Abigail lowered the violin. Her breathing was heavy, her heart still racing, but the room remained quiet. She opened her eyes and looked out at the crowd, expecting to see the same judgment and disdain from before. But instead, there was only silence. No laughter, no whispers, just silence. And then, slowly, the sound of applause began to fill the room. The applause started softly, as if the guests weren't sure at first how to respond, but soon it swelled into a full, resounding ovation. Abigail stood frozen, still holding the violin, her mind struggling to process what was happening. She had braced herself for laughter, for mocking remarks. But this was something she hadn't expected. The sound of clapping filled the grand room, and for a moment, Abigail felt like she was floating. Her heart, which had been pounding with fear moments before, now raced with disbelief. She glanced around, her eyes catching glimpses of people she'd been serving just minutes ago, now on their feet, clapping with genuine admiration. Some of the guests had even wiped tears from their eyes, moved by the melancholy beauty of her playing. Abigail couldn't remember the last time she had received this kind of praise, if she ever had. Her days had been filled with hard work, rejection letters, and the constant nagging thought that maybe her dream was too far out of reach. But here, in this opulent room filled with Savannah's wealthiest and most powerful, they weren't looking at her as just another waitress. For the first time, they were seeing her as an artist. Her fingers still gripped the violin as if afraid to let go, as if the moment might vanish if she moved too quickly. But then, a voice broke through the applause, a familiar voice that sent a chill down her spine. "Bravo," Garrett Whitman said, clapping slowly, deliberately. His smile had faded, replaced by something unreadable in his sharp, piercing gaze. He stepped forward, moving closer to Abigail as the crowd gradually settled down. Abigail's heart stuttered. The applause, though still echoing in the background, felt distant now, as Garrett's presence loomed larger. His eyes locked on hers, but the amusement she had seen earlier was gone. Instead, there was something far more serious, almost unnerving, in his expression. "That was unexpected," he said, his voice lower now, just for her to hear. The edge of mockery in his tone had disappeared, leaving behind an odd sense of curiosity. "You're quite the hidden talent, Abigail." She swallowed hard, unsure of how to respond. Part of her wanted to feel proud, to soak in the validation she'd always longed for. But the way Garrett was looking at her, so intense, so different from just minutes ago, made her uneasy. This was the same man who had tried to humiliate her, and now he was complimenting her as though her performance had shifted something within him. Garrett turned back to the room, addressing the guests with a polished ease. "It seems we've been treated to an impromptu performance by an unexpected virtuoso," he said, his voice carrying easily across the room. "Let's give her another round of applause." The crowd complied, clapping once again, though this time with a mix of admiration and lingering surprise. Abigail could feel her cheeks flushing as the applause washed over her, but she was more focused on Garrett. Something about the way he was handling the situation didn't sit right with her. She wasn't sure if he was still toying with her, or if her music had genuinely caught him off guard. And then, through the crowd, a figure emerged, an older man with silver hair and a presence that commanded attention without effort. He moved toward Abigail with purpose, his eyes never leaving her. The applause had just begun to fade when he reached her, offering a soft smile, though his expression was filled with something more. Something like awe. "You play beautifully," the man said, his voice kind and warm, but with the authority of someone used to being listened to. "I'm Leonard Chastain, conductor of the New York Philharmonic." Abigail's breath caught in her throat. She had heard of Leonard Chastain, of course. He was a legend in the world of classical music. The kind of person who could make or break a career with just a few words. She stared at him, wide-eyed, unable to fully grasp the fact that he was standing in front of her, talking to her. I'm Abigail," she stammered, suddenly feeling small again in the face of such greatness. "I know," Chastain replied with a smile. "I've heard many talented musicians in my time, but rarely does someone play with the emotion and depth that you just did. You have a gift, Abigail, one that shouldn't be confined to this room or hidden away in a restaurant." His words hit her like a wave, crashing over her. Was this really happening? Was someone like Leonard Chastain really offering her the kind of validation she had dreamed of for so long? "I'd like to invite you to audition for a spot with my orchestra," Chastain continued, his tone serious now. "I think you could be something truly special." Abigail's head spun. This was a moment straight out of her dreams. And yet, standing here in this grand ballroom, surrounded by people who had once looked down on her, she could barely believe it was real. The weight of the offer, of what it could mean for her and her future, pressed heavily on her chest. Behind her, Garrett stood quietly, watching the exchange with an expression she couldn't quite read. His initial attempt to humiliate her had backfired spectacularly, and now here she was, being offered a chance of a lifetime by one of the most influential figures in the world of classical music. For the first time that evening, Abigail felt something new stirring inside her. Hope. Real, tangible hope. Maybe, just maybe, this was the beginning of something extraordinary. The weight of Leonard Chastain's words hung in the air long after the applause had faded. Abigail stood frozen, her mind racing to catch up with everything that had just happened. Audition for the New York Philharmonic. Was this real? Was she dreaming? It all felt too impossible, too surreal to be happening to someone like her, a waitress who played violin in her spare time. The room, once buzzing with conversation, seemed to hold its breath. Guests exchanged glances, whispers spreading through the crowd like wildfire. Everyone had witnessed what should have been an embarrassing display turn into an unexpected triumph. And now, the girl who had once been invisible was the center of attention. Abigail's heart pounded as she looked at Leonard, trying to process the opportunity he was offering. This was everything she had ever dreamed of, more than she had ever thought possible. But she couldn't shake the feeling of disbelief. Why would someone like him take an interest in her? She had no formal training, no prestigious background. She was just a girl from Savannah with an old violin and a stubborn dream. She began, her voice shaky. "I don't know what to say." "You don't need to say anything right now," Leonard replied, his smile reassuring. "Take some time to think about it. But I mean what I said, Abigail. You have something rare, something that can't be taught. I see potential in you that goes beyond technical skill. When you're ready, we'll set up an audition." Her mouth felt dry and her hands, still holding the violin, were trembling slightly. How could she possibly say no to this? The chance to audition for one of the most prestigious orchestras in the world wasn't something that came along every day. But doubt gnawed at the edges of her thoughts. What if she wasn't good enough? What if this was a mistake, and she wasn't ready for such an enormous leap? She swallowed hard, forcing herself to nod. "Thank you," she said softly, her voice barely above a whisper. "Thank you so much." Leonard nodded in return, a twinkle of encouragement in his eyes. "We'll be in touch, Abigail. And remember, don't let anyone tell you that you're not worthy of this. You've earned it." With that, he turned and made his way back through the crowd, disappearing into the sea of expensive suits and glittering gowns. Abigail stood there, still clutching the violin, feeling the eyes of the room on her. The reality of what had just happened was beginning to sink in, and with it came a tidal wave of emotions, excitement, fear, hope, and a strange sense of disbelief that left her lightheaded. She carefully placed the violin back on its stand, her fingers lingering on the strings for a moment. The instrument wasn't hers, but it had been a bridge to something she never expected, an opportunity to change her life forever. As she straightened up, her gaze drifted across the room, and there, standing a few feet away, was Garrett Whitman. His arms were crossed, his sharp features unreadable, but his eyes were fixed on her. Gone was the smug expression he had worn earlier. Now, his face was a mask of something else, something she couldn't quite place. For a moment, they stared at each other, the tension between them palpable. Abigail didn't know what to expect. An apology, more mockery. But instead, Garrett's lips curled into a small, tight smile. "Well," he said, his voice low and measured, "it seems I underestimated you." Abigail blinked, taken aback by his words. She hadn't expected him to admit that, not after the way he had treated her earlier. Part of her wanted to be angry, to tell him off for trying to humiliate her in front of all these people. But another part of her, the part still reeling from the incredible offer she had just received, couldn't help but feel a strange sense of triumph. "You didn't expect me to be any good," she said, her voice steadying as she found her footing again. Garrett's smile faded slightly, but his eyes never left hers. "I suppose I didn't," he admitted, a hint of something like regret in his tone. "But you proved me wrong." There was a flicker of something else in his gaze. Respect, maybe. Abigail wasn't sure, and she wasn't interested in digging too deeply into whatever was going on in Garrett Whitman's mind. She had her own emotions to sort through, her own doubts to battle. But before she could respond, one of the other guests approached Garrett, drawing his attention away. With one last glance in her direction, he turned and disappeared into the crowd, leaving Abigail standing there, alone again. The music from the orchestra resumed, filling the space that had been occupied by the intense silence just moments before. Abigail took a deep breath, her mind spinning as she tried to grasp the enormity of what had just happened. She had come here tonight as a waitress, expected to blend into the background and serve the guests like she always did. But now she was leaving with an offer that could change everything. It was a lot to take in. As she made her way toward the exit, weaving through the crowd with far more ease than when she had arrived, her thoughts were a whirlwind. Could she really do this? Was she ready? Doubts lingered, but underneath them, a flicker of hope remained, small but steady. For the first time in a long time, the dream of becoming a violinist didn't feel so distant anymore. It felt real. It felt possible. Garrett Whitman couldn't shake the feeling that had settled over him since Abigail's performance. He had never been one to dwell on emotions, at least not his own. Emotions were messy, complicated, and in his line of work, they were a liability. He had built his empire on cold, calculated decisions, never allowing sentiment to cloud his judgment. But tonight, something had changed. That melody had stirred something deep inside him, something he had buried a long time ago. As the night went on and guests mingled, complimenting him on yet another successful event, Garrett found himself retreating to the edge of the room, his mind far from the pleasantries being exchanged around him. His thoughts kept drifting back to Abigail, standing there with that violin, the way her fingers had moved across the strings with such ease, such passion. It had been a long time since music had affected him like that. And then there was the melody itself. It was hauntingly familiar, tugging at the edges of memories he had tried to forget. He couldn't place it at first, why it felt so significant, why it had struck such a chord within him. But as the night wore on, fragments of his past began to resurface, memories he had locked away, hoping they would fade over time. Garrett moved toward the large windows at the far end of the ballroom, away from the chatter of the guests, his eyes scanning the dark Savannah skyline. The city stretched out before him, its lights twinkling in the distance. But his mind was elsewhere, back in his childhood home, in the dimly lit living room where his mother used to play the piano late into the night. He hadn't thought about those nights in years. His mother had been the one person in his life who had truly understood him, who had seen past the layers of arrogance and cold ambition that had come to define him. She had been gentle, kind, and immensely talented. Music was her way of expressing the emotions she couldn't always put into words. And Garrett had spent countless evenings sitting at her feet, listening as her fingers danced across the keys, filling their home with music that had always felt like magic to him. But that was before the accident, before everything had changed. The memory hit him like a punch to the gut. His mother's death had been sudden, tragic, a car accident that had taken her from him when he was just a teenager. In the aftermath, Garrett had closed himself off, burying his grief under layers of ambition and a desire to prove to the world that he didn't need anyone. He had thrown himself into his father's business, learning how to be ruthless, how to succeed without letting anything or anyone hold him back. But the music had died with her, until tonight. Abigail's performance had brought it all rushing back, like floodgates opening, memories pouring in. That melody, it was the same one his mother used to play. He hadn't realized it at first, but as the night went on, the pieces clicked into place. The soft, melancholic notes Abigail had played were the exact same ones his mother had composed, a piece she had written but never shared with anyone outside their home. How did Abigail know it? How could she possibly have played that exact melody? The thought gnawed at him, unsettling in its implications. He felt a strange, inexplicable connection to her now, as if the music had bridged a gap between them that neither of them understood. Garrett clenched his jaw, his fists tightening at his sides as he stared out the window. He didn't like feeling this way, vulnerable, exposed. The emotions he had spent years suppressing were rising to the surface, and he didn't know how to deal with them. He wasn't the kind of man who let the past control him. He had worked too hard to build a life where he was in control of everything. But control was slipping through his fingers, and he wasn't sure what to do about it. He thought back to Abigail's face as she played, her eyes closed, her expression focused yet serene, as if the music was the only thing in the world that mattered in that moment. She had played with a kind of passion and emotion that Garrett had long since forgotten. It was clear that she wasn't just talented, she was special. And as much as he had tried to mock her, to put her in her place, she had proven him wrong in front of everyone. There was a bitterness in that realization, but also something else, something softer. A sense of admiration, perhaps. Abigail was everything Garrett had pushed away in his pursuit of success. She was pure, driven by something deeper than ambition, and she had reminded him of the one person he had loved more than anything in the world. Garrett turned away from the window, his mind a whirlwind of conflicting thoughts. He couldn't shake the feeling that he needed to know more about Abigail, about where she came from, and how she had learned that melody. It was no coincidence, he was sure of that. And for the first time in a long time, Garrett felt a pull, a need to dig deeper, to understand what had just happened and why it had affected him so profoundly. He didn't know what he was going to do next, but one thing was certain. This wasn't the last time he would see Abigail. She had awakened something in him, something he hadn't even realized was still there, and he couldn't walk away from that. Not yet. The following days felt like a whirlwind for Abigail. It was as if her world had shifted overnight, turning her quiet, predictable life upside down. She had spent so long existing in the background, blending into the daily routine of waiting tables and practicing her violin in solitude, that she hardly knew how to handle the sudden rush of attention that came her way after the event at the Whitman estate. The invitation to audition for the New York Philharmonic wasn't just an opportunity. It was a lifeline. It felt like a dream she had been chasing for years was finally within reach. But the enormity of it terrified her. The orchestra was legendary, and Leonard Chastain was no ordinary conductor. His word carried weight in the world of classical music, and one recommendation from him could open doors Abigail hadn't even known existed. But with that chance came a crippling fear. Was she really ready? Could she possibly live up to the expectations that had suddenly been placed on her? Each night, after her shift at the restaurant, Abigail would retreat to her tiny room, pick up her violin, and play until her fingers ached. But now, the practice felt different. It wasn't just for her anymore. It was for something bigger, something real. The stakes were higher, and with each note, she could feel the pressure building. What if she failed? What if she wasn't good enough? The doubts crept in, whispering in the back of her mind every time she played. But there was no turning back now. Leonard had already set a date for her audition, and it was only a few weeks away. Time seemed to move faster with each passing day, and before she knew it, Abigail was standing outside the rehearsal hall of a local orchestra, clutching her violin case like it was the only thing keeping her grounded. The hall was small but grand in its own way, with high ceilings and wooden floors that echoed every step. Abigail took a deep breath as she walked in, her heart racing. Leonard had arranged for her to rehearse with some musicians in preparation for the audition, and today was her first official session with them. It was a chance for her to fine-tune her performance, to prove to herself that she belonged here. But as she stepped inside and saw the other musicians setting up, her nerves flared up all over again. These people were professionals, men and women who had been playing in orchestras for years. They barely glanced at her as she walked in, absorbed in tuning their instruments and chatting among themselves. Abigail felt a wave of insecurity wash over her. Who was she to be here among them? A waitress with no formal training, no prestigious background. She didn't even own a proper violin. She took her place at the far end of the room, unpacking her violin carefully, her hands trembling as she adjusted the strings. The instrument still carried the worn look of something well used but dearly loved. Her grandfather's gift had carried her this far, but now, surrounded by polished, expensive instruments and seasoned musicians, it felt inadequate. Still, it was all she had. As the rehearsal began, the conductor, a stern-looking man with graying hair, called for silence. Abigail focused on the sheet music in front of her, trying to drown out her nerves. But as the first notes filled the room, it became clear that she was out of her depth. The musicians played with precision, their timing perfect, their sound full and rich. Abigail, on the other hand, struggled to keep up. Her bow slipped on the strings, her fingers faltered, and each mistake felt magnified in the echo of the rehearsal hall. Halfway through the session, the conductor paused and looked directly at her. "Miss Abigail," he said, his voice neutral but firm. "You need to keep up with the tempo. This isn't a solo performance. You must learn to blend with the orchestra." His words stung, but Abigail nodded quickly, swallowing the lump of insecurity that had risen in her throat. She tried again, pushing herself to stay in time, to match the others. But the pressure only seemed to make her mistakes worse. By the end of the session, her confidence had all but crumbled. She packed up her violin quietly, avoiding the eyes of the other musicians as they left the hall. Outside, the cold evening air hit her like a splash of water. Abigail stood on the steps of the rehearsal hall, clutching her violin case tightly. Doubts swirled in her mind, louder than ever. She wasn't ready for this. She wasn't like these people, who had been trained from a young age, who lived and breathed music every day. She had spent her life waiting tables and practicing alone in a cramped room. What made her think she could compete with them? But then, as she stood there, trying to gather her thoughts, a voice broke through her despair. "Rough session?" She looked up to see a woman in her mid-30s, carrying a cello case, smiling at her with a kind, knowing expression. She was one of the musicians from the rehearsal, someone Abigail hadn't spoken to yet. "Yeah," Abigail admitted, her voice shaky. "I guess you could say that." The woman nodded, walking over to stand beside her. "Don't let it get to you. We all have bad days. And besides, you've got something most of us don't." Abigail raised an eyebrow, confused. "What's that?" "Heart," the woman said simply. "I heard it in your playing. Sure, you made some mistakes, but the way you play, you can tell it means something to you. That's not something you can teach." Abigail blinked, the woman's words sinking in slowly. "Heart. She had always played from her heart, from the love of the music and the memories it held. Maybe that was what had brought her this far. "Thanks," Abigail said softly, a small smile tugging at her lips. "I needed to hear that." The woman nodded and gave her a reassuring pat on the shoulder before heading off into the night, leaving Abigail standing there on the steps. The cold air no longer felt as harsh, and though her doubts were still there, they didn't feel quite as overwhelming. Maybe, just maybe, she was ready after all. Garrett sat in his office, a massive room lined with bookshelves and dark mahogany furniture, staring out the floor-to-ceiling windows that overlooked the city of Savannah. He had spent the last several days immersed in work, trying to bury himself in meetings, contracts, and business deals. It was his usual way of dealing with anything that threatened to unearth emotions he wasn't ready to face. But no matter how many emails he answered or how many calls he took, his mind kept drifting back to one person, Abigail. It wasn't just the performance that haunted him. That would have been easy enough to dismiss as a fluke, a moment of unexpected talent that had surprised him. But it was more than that. It was the way the music had pulled something out of him, something he had long thought dead and buried. He had spent years closing off that part of himself, telling himself that emotions were a weakness, that caring too much only led to pain. And for the most part, it had worked. He had built a life where nothing touched him unless he allowed it. But Abigail's music had reached places he hadn't allowed himself to visit in a long time. The melody she played, the same one his mother had composed, had brought memories flooding back. Memories of a time when he hadn't been this closed-off, calculating person, when he had been human. Garrett sighed and rubbed a hand over his face. He wasn't used to feeling conflicted, and he hated it. Normally, he made decisions quickly, decisively, without second-guessing himself. But this was different. Abigail had stirred something in him, and he didn't know how to deal with it. He had learned more about her over the past few days, quietly making inquiries through his network. It wasn't hard to find out who she was, Abigail, the daughter of a seamstress and a carpenter. No formal music education, a waitress by day, a violinist by night. It was clear that she hadn't come from money or privilege, and yet she had something special. The kind of raw talent and passion that couldn't be bought or taught. And then there was the mystery of the melody. How had she come to play the very same music his mother had written? It couldn't be a coincidence. But no matter how much he tried to rationalize it, the answer eluded him. The knock on his office door pulled Garrett from his thoughts. His assistant, Rachel, peeked in. "Mr. Whitman, you have a call from Mr. Leonard Chastain." Garrett straightened in his chair. Leonard Chastain. The man who had offered Abigail a chance of a lifetime at his event. Garrett hadn't spoken to him directly since that night, but now it seemed the maestro had something to say. "Put him through," Garrett said, leaning forward. A moment later, the familiar voice of the renowned conductor filled the room. "Garrett, it's Leonard." "Leonard," Garrett replied, his tone smooth and professional. "What can I do for you?" "I wanted to talk to you about Abigail," Leonard said, getting straight to the point. "I understand you've taken a particular interest in her." Garrett's brow furrowed slightly. "I wouldn't call it a particular interest. I'm simply curious. She has an undeniable talent, as you saw that night." Leonard chuckled. "Yes, she does. And I have to say, I've rarely seen someone with so much potential who hasn't had formal training. That's part of why I've extended an invitation for her to audition for the Philharmonic. But she's going to need support if she's going to make it." Garrett's eyes narrowed. "Support?" "She's talented but raw," Leonard continued. "She's never had the proper resources or guidance to hone her skills. You and I both know how competitive the world of classical music is. Talent alone isn't always enough. She's going to need more than just her violin and a dream if she's going to succeed." Garrett leaned back in his chair, his fingers tapping lightly on the desk. "What are you asking, Leonard?" "I'm asking if you're willing to help her," Leonard said, his voice firm but not demanding. "You have the means. the connections. She needs someone who believes in her, someone who can give her the opportunity to grow into the artist she's meant to be. Garrett didn't respond immediately. He hadn't expected this. He had spent days grappling with his own emotions about Abigail, unsure of what to do next. And now, here was Leonard, asking him to take an active role in her future. It was a strange proposition. Garrett wasn't in the habit of helping people. He was known for his business acumen, his ability to turn a profit, not for being someone's benefactor. But as he sat there, considering Leonard's words, something clicked inside him. Abigail had touched something in him that he hadn't felt in years. Maybe it was time to stop running from that. Maybe this was the moment to do something different, something he had never done before. Help someone not because it benefited him, but because it was the right thing to do. "I'll think about it," Garrett said finally, his voice measured. Leonard seemed satisfied with that. "That's all I ask, Garrett. She deserves a chance, and I think you're the one who can give it to her." After a brief exchange of pleasantries, the call ended, and Garrett sat in silence, the weight of the conversation settling over him. Could he really do this? Could he step into the role of a mentor, of someone who used his resources to help rather than control? The idea of supporting Abigail felt strange, but also oddly right. She had already changed something in him, and now it seemed like the next step was clear. He had to stop being a spectator in her journey. He had to make a choice. And for once, Garrett was ready to make the decision that wasn't just about him. Garrett didn't waste any time after the phone call with Leonard. The more he thought about it, the clearer it became that he couldn't just stand on the sidelines. He had never been one to let things happen to him. He had always taken control of his own destiny, shaping events to suit his needs. This time, though, it wasn't about him. It was about Abigail and what she could become if given the right support. But the first step was the hardest. He had to face her. Garrett knew that he had put her through a humiliating experience at his event, and if he was going to offer her help, he needed to address that. He wasn't used to admitting he was wrong, but something about Abigail, the way she had risen above his taunts, the way her music had cut through all his pretenses, made him realize that he owed her at least that. He found out where she lived easily enough. It wasn't far from the center of Savannah, in a modest neighborhood that was a world away from the opulence Garrett was used to. Her apartment was small, the kind of place that spoke of hard work and perseverance. As he parked his car and approached the door, Garrett felt a pang of discomfort. This was a side of life he had spent years distancing himself from, but now he was stepping right into it. He knocked on the door, unsure of what to expect. When it opened, he was greeted by Abigail, her expression shifting from surprise to something unreadable as soon as she saw him. She stood in the doorway, her violin case at her side, clearly on her way out. "Garrett," she said, her tone neutral, though her eyes betrayed a flicker of confusion. "What are you doing here?" Garrett cleared his throat, suddenly aware of how out of place he looked in his tailored suit against the backdrop of her modest apartment complex. He wasn't used to feeling nervous, but here he was, standing awkwardly in front of a woman who had every reason to shut the door in his face. "I came to talk," he said, keeping his voice calm, "about what happened at the event, and about what comes next." Abigail's brow furrowed, and for a moment, she didn't say anything. She just looked at him, as if trying to figure out if this was some kind of trick. Finally, she stepped aside, motioning for him to come in. "All right, let's talk." Garrett walked in, taking in the small living room. It was simple but cozy, with a few personal touches. A photo of her family on the mantel, sheet music scattered across a worn coffee table. He could see how much of her life revolved around music, even in this small space. Abigail sat down on the edge of the couch, her posture tense, while Garrett remained standing, not quite sure how to begin. This wasn't something he was used to, apologies, humility. But he had to try. "I owe you an apology," Garrett started, his tone measured but sincere. "What I did at the event, it wasn't right. I put you on the spot to humiliate you, and that's not something I'm proud of." Abigail's eyes flicked up to meet his, a hint of surprise flashing in them. She hadn't expected this. Garrett Whitman, the arrogant businessman who had mocked her in front of a room full of people, was now standing in her living room, apologizing. "I've spent a lot of time thinking about that night," he continued. "And I realize now that I was wrong about you. You're not just a waitress or someone to be dismissed. You're a real talent, Abigail. Your music. It's something special." Abigail crossed her arms, her expression softening but still guarded. "So, why are you here? To make amends?" Garrett paused, considering his next words carefully. "Partially, but also because I believe you have the potential to do something great, and I want to help you get there." Abigail blinked, clearly taken aback. She had expected a lot of things from Garrett, maybe more condescension, maybe another round of smug superiority, but she hadn't expected this. "Help me. Why?" "Because you've got something that money can't buy," Garrett said, his voice firm now. "Passion, raw talent. I've spent my life building empires, but I've never seen anyone play the way you did that night. You reminded me of something I lost a long time ago. And I don't want to see you throw that away because you didn't have the support you needed." Abigail stared at him, her arms still crossed, but the walls she had built around herself were beginning to crack. There was sincerity in Garrett's voice that she hadn't heard before. For the first time, he didn't seem like the cold, calculating businessman she had come to know. He seemed human. "You think I can make it?" she asked, her voice softer now, a hint of vulnerability creeping in. "I know you can," Garrett replied without hesitation. "And I want to help you do it. Leonard Chastain sees it too. He's giving you the opportunity of a lifetime. But you're going to need more than just talent to succeed. You're going to need resources, connections, and guidance." Abigail took a deep breath, her thoughts swirling. Part of her wanted to tell him no, to shut the door on this entire chapter of her life and move on. But another part of her, the part that had dreamed of becoming a violinist since she was a little girl, couldn't ignore the chance that was being offered. "All right," she said finally, meeting Garrett's gaze with a newfound determination. "I'll accept your help. But this doesn't mean I trust you." Garrett nodded, a small smile tugging at the corner of his lips. "Fair enough. I'll earn it." With that, the two of them stood on the edge of something new, an uneasy partnership built on a foundation of shared purpose. Garrett had made his decision. Now, it was up to both of them to see it through. The lights of the concert hall flickered above Abigail as she stood backstage, clutching her violin case. The soft hum of the audience settling into their seats echoed through the thick curtains, and she could feel the anticipation building in the air. This was it. The moment she had been working toward for weeks. Her first performance as a soloist with the orchestra. Her first real chance to prove herself. Her hands trembled slightly as she adjusted the shoulder rest on her violin. The nerves were undeniable, but mixed with them was something else. Excitement, determination. She had come a long way from that first night at Garrett's event, where she had been humiliated only to turn the tables with her unexpected performance. Now, with Leonard Chastain's guidance and Garrett's unexpected support, she was standing on the brink of something life-changing. Leonard had been instrumental in preparing her for this night. His rehearsals were grueling, but they had molded her into a more confident and polished musician. Day after day, Abigail had poured every ounce of energy she had into perfecting her technique, mastering the piece she would perform tonight. It was a classical concerto, challenging but beautiful, a true test of her abilities. Still, despite all the preparation, the doubts lingered. The stakes were high, and she knew that this performance could make or break her future. The musicians in the Philharmonic were professionals with years of experience, and Abigail, despite all her progress, still felt like the outsider. But as Leonard had reminded her time and again, it wasn't about perfection, it was about heart. That was something no one could teach, and it was something Abigail had in abundance. As she stood there, waiting for her cue to take the stage, the door to the backstage area opened, and in walked Garrett. He was dressed impeccably, as always, but his expression was softer than she had ever seen it. There was no hint of the arrogance or coldness that had marked their first interactions. Instead, he seemed genuinely proud. "Are you ready?" he asked, his voice low, but there was an edge of concern to it. Abigail swallowed hard, her nerves momentarily getting the best of her. "I think so," she replied, her voice barely above a whisper. "I've practiced, but—" She trailed off, unsure of how to put into words the swirl of emotions she was feeling. Garrett stepped closer, his eyes searching hers. "You're going to be amazing. You've worked hard for this, and you deserve to be here." Abigail looked at him, surprised by the sincerity in his voice. She had accepted his help, but part of her had still been wary, unsure of his true intentions. But over the past few weeks, Garrett had shown her a side of himself that she hadn't expected, a side that was genuinely invested in her success, not for his own gain, but because he believed in her. "Thank you," she said softly, meeting his gaze. "I'm nervous, but I'm ready." Garrett nodded, offering a rare, small smile. "Good. I'll be out there watching." With that, he stepped back, giving her the space she needed as the final call came from the stage manager. It was time. Abigail took a deep breath, steadying herself as she gripped her violin case. The familiar weight of the instrument in her hands was comforting, reminding her of all the hours she had spent playing, practicing, dreaming. This was her moment. She had to own it. The sound of applause swelled as the conductor took his place at the podium. Abigail stepped out onto the stage, her heart pounding in her chest. The concert hall was enormous, far bigger than any venue she had ever performed in before. The bright lights made it hard to see the faces of the audience, but she knew they were out there, hundreds of eyes, watching, waiting. As she took her place in the center of the stage, the orchestra behind her, she glanced out into the crowd. Somewhere in the sea of faces, Garrett sat, along with Leonard and dozens of other important figures from the world of music. The pressure was immense, but she couldn't let it overwhelm her. The conductor raised his baton, and the first notes of the orchestra filled the hall, soft and deliberate, setting the stage for Abigail's entrance. Her fingers trembled as she lifted her bow to the strings, but the moment the first note left her violin, something shifted inside her. The music flowed from her like water, each note resonating with the passion and emotion she had carried with her for so long. The melody wrapped around the audience, pulling them into the world she created with her violin. The hours of practice, the late nights, the doubts and fears, all of it disappeared as she played. In this moment, there was only the music, and it was everything. Her fingers moved effortlessly across the strings, her bow dancing with precision and grace. The audience was captivated, the silence in the room thick with awe. Abigail lost herself in the music, letting it guide her through the piece, each note rising and falling with perfect timing. When the final note echoed through the hall and faded into silence, Abigail lowered her violin, her heart still racing. The room was completely still for a moment, as if everyone was holding their breath. And then, slowly, the applause began. Soft at first, but quickly building into a thunderous ovation. The sound washed over her, filling the space with warmth and admiration. Abigail stood there, breathing heavily, taking it all in. She had done it. She had performed in front of a crowd that expected perfection, and she had given them something even better, something real, something filled with heart. As she looked out into the crowd, she caught sight of Garrett, standing at the back of the room, clapping with the same quiet pride she had seen before. Their eyes met, and in that brief moment, Abigail knew that everything had changed, not just for her, but for both of them. This was only the beginning. The applause was still ringing in Abigail's ears as she stepped off the stage, her heart pounding with the thrill of what had just happened. She had done it. After all the late nights, the doubts, the fears, she had performed in front of a packed concert hall and received a standing ovation. It felt surreal, like she was floating in a dream. Backstage, the energy was electric. The musicians congratulated her, offering smiles and words of praise. Leonard Chastain himself was waiting for her, his eyes twinkling with approval. "That was extraordinary, Abigail," he said, his voice warm and genuine. "You played with heart, exactly as I knew you would." "Thank you, Leonard," Abigail replied, breathless but beaming. "I can't believe this is real." "It is," Leonard said with a smile. "And this is only the beginning. You have a bright future ahead of you, Abigail. I have no doubt about that." She nodded, the weight of his words sinking in. This wasn't just a one-time performance. This was the start of something much bigger. But even as the excitement of the moment buzzed around her, there was still one person she hadn't spoken to yet. Garrett. As the crowd began to filter out of the concert hall, Abigail spotted him standing near the exit, watching her with that same unreadable expression. He had been there, just as he'd promised, and now she needed to talk to him. There was something about the way he had been acting these last few weeks, something that hinted at a deeper connection, a shared past she didn't fully understand. She made her way through the remaining musicians and toward him, her heart fluttering with anticipation. Garrett straightened as she approached, his hands slipping into the pockets of his perfectly tailored suit. But there was a softness in his gaze that hadn't been there before. "You were brilliant," he said quietly, his voice sincere. "I knew you would be." Abigail felt her cheeks flush slightly under his praise, but she wasn't here just for compliments. She needed answers. "Garrett, I have to ask you something," she said, her voice steady despite the whirlwind of emotions inside her. "That melody, the one I played at your event, it's been in my family for as long as I can remember. My grandfather taught it to me, but no one ever knew where it came from. How did you recognize it?" Garrett's face shifted, the calm expression flickering with something deeper, something that had been buried for years. He looked down for a moment, as if gathering his thoughts, before meeting her gaze again. "It wasn't just the melody that caught my attention that night," Garrett began, his voice lower now, more serious. "It was the way you played it. You see, that melody, it was written by my mother." Abigail's breath caught in her throat. His mother. How could that be? But how? Garrett hesitated, his gaze distant as if the memories were pulling him back. "My mother was a musician, a brilliant one. She wrote that piece years ago, but she never shared it with anyone outside of our home. She used to play it for me when I was a child, before she died. I hadn't heard it in years, until you played it at that event." Abigail felt a chill run down her spine. The melody her grandfather had taught her, the one that had been passed down through her family, had come from Garrett's mother. How was that possible? "Garrett, I don't understand," she said, her voice barely a whisper. He took a deep breath, his eyes locking onto hers with a quiet intensity. "There's more, Abigail. I did some digging after that night, trying to understand how you could know a piece of music that only existed in my family. What I found changes everything." Abigail's heart pounded in her chest. She could feel the ground shifting beneath her, the pieces of her life rearranging in ways she hadn't expected. "Your grandfather," Garrett said slowly, "wasn't just a musician. He was my mother's first love." The words hung in the air between them, heavy with meaning. Abigail stared at him, trying to process what he had just said. "My grandfather knew your mother?" Garrett nodded. "Yes, they were together before she met my father, but it was more than that, Abigail." He paused, letting the weight of his next words settle. "Your mother, the one you've always known, isn't your biological mother. You're my mother's daughter." The world seemed to tilt as Abigail took a step back, her mind reeling. "What?" she whispered, the word barely audible. "That can't be." "I know it's a lot to take in," Garrett said softly, "but it's the truth. Your grandfather raised you as his own after my mother died, keeping her identity and your true parentage a secret. He didn't want you caught up in my father's world, the world of power and wealth that destroyed her. Abigail's head spun with the revelation. Her entire life had been built on a foundation she hadn't known was a lie. Garrett's mother was her mother, too. The melody that had connected them was more than just a piece of music. It was a thread linking them to a shared past. Tears welled in Abigail's eyes, the weight of it all crashing down on her. Garrett stepped closer, his expression softening as he reached out, placing a gentle hand on her shoulder. "You're not alone, Abigail," he said, his voice steady and comforting. "You've never been alone. We're family." Abigail looked up at him, her vision blurred by tears. But there was a sense of peace settling over her. It was as if the missing pieces of her life had finally fallen into place. For the first time, she didn't feel like she was fighting the world alone. She had found her place, her family. And together, she and Garrett could move forward, honoring the memory of the mother they both shared. This was their new beginning.